The newly reworked Warriors of Chaos have one of the largest rosters in the game, with not only a large selection of their own units, but also access to all 4 rosters from the Mono God Chaos factions. This grants them a huge choice when building their armies, with excellent choices for front lines, magic, and of course a huge amount of powerful demons and monsters. This behemoth roster can sometimes be a little bit overwhelming, but once you find the right combinations, you can make some incredibly powerful armies. First, let's go over the pros and cons of the roster overall. First of all, obviously, that huge size allows for a variety of army builds, so they keep being fun to play for a very long time, as well as being pretty crazy strong. The massive selection of powerful monsters allow them to walk over most enemies with ease, with very few factions being able to hold them all back. They also have a huge selection of very powerful magical laws to support your army and wipe out the enemies. As for the cons, the huge roster can be overwhelming, and trying to use a bit of everything can cause you to sacrifice being the best at any one thing. Also, despite the huge size, you don't have the most ranged options in the world, so against factions with a ton of missiles, you'll often be forced to move up on them and suffer their barrages. And finally, depending on your lord choices, you can also lock yourself out from a large chunk of the roster. The 4 base game lords can use everything, but the Champions of Chaos are limited to Undivided and their own pantheon, so miss out on a lot of powerful choices. Also, just before we get into this roster, we're going to do this one a little bit differently. Like I just mentioned, when playing as any of the Undivided lords like Archaon or Bellicor, you can get access to units from the entire Warriors of Chaos roster, as well as all 4 Monogod factions. This means the actual size of the Warriors of Chaos roster is ridiculously huge, and covering it all in one video would make it into a feature-length film, and the majority of it would be me repeating myself from previous videos. So if you want to know about the Monogod rosters, I'll pop some links down below and on screen now, and in this video I'll go over the units that are exclusive to the Warriors of Chaos. Hope that's all okay, I don't want to waste your time as much as mine. Now let's get into the roster because we still have plenty to get through. First up we have our lords, and first up we of course have the legendary lords, starting with Archaon the Everchosen. He's of course a spellcaster with access to Law of Fire mixed with Death and Metal, which is a pretty foul combination. He also is armoured and shielded, deals armour piercing damage, and is a melee expert. He only has one choice of mount, Dorgar. This grants him a ton of speed and charge bonus, making him into an excellent charging lord. Archaon is a fierce fighter, with outstanding melee stats, great damage, and can easily cut through armour and resistances with ease. He's also incredibly tanky with his massive armour stat and silver shield, so can take as much damage as he slings out. To top it all off, he has that powerful mixed lord that can take out chaff and armour with ease, and you have a lord that's hard to use badly. You want to throw him into the front lines to focus down key targets on the enemy force, such as high damage infantry or enemy lords and heroes. While he's there, toss out the odd cast to support the rest of the army, and he should do just great. His mount only makes him faster and better at all of this, as well as making him into a powerful charger, so grab that and zoom in and out of enemies for great value. Next we have Kolek Suneater. He's of course armoured, deals armour piercing damage, causes terror, and has scaly skin, so missile resistance. Kolek is of course an amazing fighter and always has been. He has a huge HP bar, massive armour, crazy damage, and large area attacks. Tossing him into a group of enemies and watching his kills climb has been a treat since the Warhammer 1 launch, and not much has changed here. Of course, keep him safe from being focused from range or anti-large melee troops, as his large size can make him into a large target. Just keep him on the move fighting big groups of key enemy units, and he can't really do a bad job as long as he keeps fighting. Next up we have Prince Rapgod Sigvald the Magnificent. He's armoured and shielded, a melee expert, comes with perfect vigour, and has charge defense versus all. He has no mounts or spells, but Siggy is still as powerful a battler as he is a wordsmith, so he's not half bad. He's incredibly tough with a ton of armour, the silver shield, and some decent HP and amazing melee stats. His damage, however, isn't the greatest in the world. Yes, his attack is fabulous, but his weapon strength is lacking a ton of armour piercing, so against anything super tough, it's going to take him a while to punch through. On the bright side, even if it takes him hours to fight through tough armour, his perfect vigour will ensure he's at full energy the entire time. He'll still do a great job versus less armoured single entities or groups of enemy infantry, as long as he doesn't get overwhelmed by high armour piercing damage. Zazel's next up. He's a spellcaster, deals armour piercing damage, causes terror, and is flying, and he has access to the Law of Slaanesh. In typical Slaanesh fashion, Azazel has next to no armour and instead relies on resistance to stay healthy. This means against targets with no magical damage, he will be incredibly tanky, but against those with them, he'll go down scarily fast. On the bright side, he's incredibly fast as a flying demon, so can zip around the map at breakneck pace to give assistance wherever needed, either in the form of fighting or the Law of Slaanesh. His melee stats are top notch, and his armour piercing and magical weapon strength can cut through the toughest layers of armour and resistance with ease. So choose the toughest targets on the enemy side, make sure they don't have their own magical damage, and throw them in for a ton of value. He also has his Domineering Aura ability, which will debuff nearby enemy melee stats for each enemy unit wavering or lower within the radius. Next up we have our second champion, and that's Festus the Leechlord. He's a spellcaster and has mutually exclusive abilities. He can either have the Healing Elixirs or the Harbinger of Pestilence active at a time to either heal or damage nearby units, and he also has poison attacks and the Law of Nurgle. Festus is really the support lord of the Champions and Warriors of Chaos. He's not particularly tough with moderate HP for a Nurgle lord, not much armor or resistance. He also doesn't deal a massive amount of damage with his mid-melee stats and weapon strength, even with poison and magical attacks. What he does have, however, is access to the disgustingly fun lore of Nurgle and his mutually exclusive abilities. Both of these will allow him to sit in the middle of his army and either support his own troops or bring suffering to their enemies. It's not the most active form of participation, but it does get the job done nicely, and you can always send him in to fight against low damage and low armor targets here and there, as long as it doesn't screw up his overall central positioning. Next we have Valkyria the Bloody. She's armoured and shielded, deals armor-piercing anti-large damage, and is of course flying. In true Khorne fashion, Valkyria is an incredibly powerful fighter. She has excellent toughness with her armour, high speed with her flight, and brilliant frontlines prowess with her high melee stats and massive weapon strength. The anti-large bonus also makes her into a great large target duelist that wants to be used to take on large threats on the enemy force and take them out one by one before they can get any more value. Of course, she'll still do fine on the front lines versus clusters of infantry, despite what the trailer would have you believe. Just make sure she doesn't get focused down too much or surrounded, otherwise escaping could quickly become a challenge. To top it all off, her Gaze of Khorne ability causes nearby units to gain increases to weapon strength and leadership, so she's excellent at leading from the front of your fights. Village the Curseling, as a spellcaster, is armoured as well as having access to the barrier and the Lore of Siege. These two that become one are a great little lord with excellent toughness, with the ever-balanced barrier of Siege, pretty good armour, and a good chunk of HP. On the damage side of things, they again impress with pretty good melee stats, magical damage, and high weapon strength, albeit not very armour-piercing. This makes them excellent versus low armour units or units that rely on resistance, but they fall off as they get more armoured. Thankfully, they can also use the Lore of Siege to rain down destruction and more on the battlefield, which is not short of ways to deal with armoured targets. And finally, their Twisted Twin ability increases their spellmaster and melee stats by larger amounts the more time they spend casting spells or in combat, so get them in and leave them in. And our final legendary lord is of course Be'lakor. He's a spellcaster, deals armor-piercing damage, causes terror, and is of course flying. He also has access to Lore of Shadows, yet another starfighter from our final demon lord. He's not the toughest with medium armor, but his high HP and resistance more than make up for this. He also will do great damage with great melee stats and a super high armor piercing and magical weapon strength, making him a great choice for fighting pretty much whatever you want. Use his high speed to get him onto the toughest target the enemy has, and use that damage to wipe them out in record speed. You can also make use of his Lore of Shadows, which is of course great for damage as well as granting your army a ton of buffs. And finally, if he's ever in a dicey situation, you can always use his Shadow Shroud ability to give him 40% flat damage reduction and give him a chance to make his way out to fight another day. Coming to the generic lords now, and as we get into the generic units, I should first mention that a lot of units have variations from the different branches of Chaos. These variations come with the marks from each of the 4 branches and sometimes other effects. Khorne's mark grants frenzy, armor and spell resistance but reduces melee defense. Nurgle's mark grants poison attacks, HP and melee defense, but reduced melee attack and speed. Slaanesh grants immunity to psychology, strider, physical resistance and speed, and Siege grants the barrier and magical attacks. These variations often don't really change too drastically how the unit performs, so I'll mention them and show their stats, but most of the time I'm not going to go too in depth in the interest of time and not repeating myself. So with all that being said, our first generic lord is the Chaos Lord. These are armoured and shielded and are melee experts. They have 4 choices of mounts: the Chaos Steed for even more armor, a ton of speed and some charge bonus, the Chaos Chariot, which drops some melee stats in exchange for speed and a ton of charge bonus as well as armor piercing anti-infantry damage, Manticore, which grants flying and some charge bonus at the expense of melee stats and becoming a larger and easier to spot target, and the Chaos Dragon, which becomes a huge tag in the air, gains a ton of damage, flaming attacks, and the Dark Fire of Chaos Breath ability. These guys can also grant the mark of Khorne, and they also gain weapon strength and charge bonus. They lose the Chaos Dragon mount and swap the Chaos Chariot for the Gorebeast Chariot, which has more armor, damage, and flaming attacks, but less defense and no shield. And they also swap the Manticore for the Juggernaut, a totally different beast, literally. It can't fly, but it's still pretty fast and grants more armor-piercing damage, as well as a good bit of charge bonus. They can also get access to the Mark of Slaanesh, in which case they lose the Manticore and the Chaos Dragon. These lads work great as frontlines leaders with their pretty great toughness and decent damage. Their armor and shields make them incredibly tanky, especially early on when there's not a lot of armor piercing on the field. Their damage is really good for the early game with great melee stats and pretty good damage, but the lack of armor piercing will make it fall off as you get later into the campaign. Of the mounts, I would of course go for the Chaos Dragon, since it's the best for battling, the flying is always useful, and a breath ability can get a ton of value. If you go in Khorne, then the Juggernaut, and the Steed for Slaanesh, since I hate chariots, but if you can use them, then go for that, since they're technically better if done right. Next we have the Chaos Sorcerer Lord. These are spellcasters and armoured. They have access to 4 mounts: the Chaos Steed, Manticore, the Chaos War Shrine, which is a slow moving mount that provides support buffs to nearby units, similar to a corpse cart. All versions have favour of the ruinous powers, and the undivided version comes with physical resistance for nearby allied units that increases for every entity death, enemy or friendly, and they also have access to the Chaos Dragon. You can get these guys with the Law of Death, the Law of Fire, the Law of Metal, or the Law of Shadows. If you go for the Law of Death or Shadows, you can get the Mark of Nurgle, which then also grants you access to the Law of Nurgle if you choose it. They lose the Manticore and the Chaos Dragon and swap the Chaos Shrine for the Nurgle Chaos Shrine, which now has the Giver of Abundance Glory ability. If they are the Law of Metal or the Law of Fire, they can get the Mark of Tzeentch, as well as the Law of Tzeentch if they choose it, and they lose the Chaos Dragon mount, swap the Manticore for the Disc of Tzeentch. These make them incredibly fast targets that don't have a huge hitbox. Aside from that, they gain a small amount of charge bonus, but nothing too crazy. And they also swap the Chaos War Shrine for the Tzeentch Chaos War Shrine, which now has the Giver of Arcane Glory ability. Of course, these lads are much more on the support side of things when compared to the Chaos Lords. They are still decently tough and have okay damage and melee stats, but as soon as you're out of the early game and there's some actual damage on the field, you're going to want to use these guys in the back line to support rather than the front. Luckily, you have some great choices for Law of Magic here, so grab your preferred, which should be Fire or Shadows, and cast away to get damage or support value wherever you can. For these guys, you could go for the Chaos Dragon again to make them able to fight and cast as well, but I like to go for the Chaos War Shrines as the buffs to nearby units work excellently with their spellcasting playstyle, and I like shrines for every Chaos option here. Now, final generic lore type are of course the Demon Princes, and these are of course spellcasters. The generic versions that Be'lakor can get come with the Law of Fire, but if you evolve them from Chaos Sorcerer Lords, they'll just carry over whatever lore they had once they get upgraded. These can of course come with all 4 marks of Chaos. Khorne also grants them increased weapon strength and flaming attack, but of course will never get any Laws of Magic. Nurgle will also give them more weapon strength, Slaanesh will give them a soporific musk, and Tzeentch will lose a little bit of weapon strength. Now these guys are all excellent lords with high HP and resistance, making them deceptively tough as long as you aren't against magical damage. They also have great melee stats and high magical damage in large area attacks. This makes them into great lords for sending into the depths of the front lines and leaving them there to rack up a ton of kills on less armoured enemies. Of course, if the enemy has any magical damage, you want to avoid that like the plague, but aside from that, they are free to target whoever they want, especially with the flight, allowing them to zoom around the map with ease. There isn't really a bad way you can use these guys, other than to not use them. Coming to our heroes now, first up we have the Exalted hero. These are armoured and shielded, have 3 choices of mounts, the Chaos Steed, the Chaos Chariot, and the Manticore. They also gain access to 2 marks of Chaos. Khorne also grants some weapon strength and charge bonus, swaps the Chaos Chariot for the Gorebeast Chariot, and the Manticore for the Juggernaut. Or they can choose Nurgle, which also grants them more weapon strength and charge bonus, but they lose the Manticore mount. These are just a small version of Chaos Lords with slightly worse stats. They are still decently tough and can do some pretty good damage on the front lines until the enemy gets a ton of armor or damage involved. Keep them in and fighting against anything that isn't too tough or dealing too much damage to encourage your units and get them some slight damage numbers. Just don't get them too surrounded or focused, or you will lose them. For mounts, you can't go wrong with the Manticore. Still flying, and even if it's not as much damage as the Chaos Dragon, it will still do just fine in some decent combat, and the same choice as the Lord for the Chaos variations. Our other heroes are the Chaos Sorcerers. These are still armoured spellcasters, and have access to 3 mounts, the Chaos Steed, the Manticore, and the Chaos War Shrine, and they come with these same 4 choices of laws as the Lords. They can get access to 2 marks of Chaos, Slaanesh, which loses the Manticore mount and swaps for the Chaos War Shrine for a Slaanesh Chaos War Shrine, which now has the Giver of Torturous Glory ability, or Tzeentch, which swaps the Manticore for the Disc of Tzeentch, and the Chaos War Shrine for the Tzeentch Chaos War Shrine. Again, basically smaller versions of the Lords. These are still not the toughest or best fighters, so want to fight weak, low damage and armor units and spend most of their time supporting their army with spells. Still go for the Chaos War Shrine mount to get all the buffs you can onto your army, and the same War Shrines for all the Chaos versions. Not going to go into too much detail, these guys exactly the same as Lords, just a little bit weaker. Now we come to our actual units. First up we have melee infantry, and first up we have the Marauders. These are a tier 1 unit, are shielded, and come with the Mark of Khorne, which gains them even more armor, the Mark of Nurgle, Slaanesh, and Tzeentch. These are your Billy basic early game infantry. They're not too tough and don't do a ton of damage, but when you're using them, they'll do a serviceable job against other units unlocked at the same time. Their main job is to keep the enemy line still and wait for support in the form of missiles, monsters, and magic to arrive to do the real damage and take out the enemy. Just move them up and engage with the enemy front lines as quickly as you can, and they'll be doing their part. They also come in another variation, Great Weapons Marauders. These are a tier 1 and deal armor piercing damage. They can also come in a Nurgle variation. These guys can now do some actual damage, but it is at the cost of making them somehow even squishier. They gain some armor piercing damage, so will do better against armored targets, though in the early game these will be few and far between. I wouldn't replace my entire Marauder line with these guys as they're simply too squishy for the damage they gain. I would instead use a mix of both and have these guys focus on the toughest units on the enemy lines to wipe them out as quickly as possible, still providing with support to take out their targets as fast as possible, otherwise their low defense and mediocre leadership will result in a quick death or retreat. We also have Spear Marauders of Tzeentch. These are a tier 1 unit, have the barrier, anti-large, and charge defense versus large. Yes, they are technically a monogod unit, but they are brand new to the Warriors of Chaos, so I'm going to cover them here because they've never been covered before. These are the only Spear Marauders you can now get in the Warriors of Chaos, and they of course come with anti-large and that charge defense, making them great for absorbing early game game camp monster charges and turning the pressure back onto their attackers. I do use a couple of these guys to protect my flanks and absorb charges from anything that makes them, then focus down large targets on the front lines to make the most of that bonus damage. They also have a pretty good defense, so you could also make them into a full front line in the early game just to make it as tough as possible. Just make sure to keep up with the support from other units and they should do great. Next we have the Scourges Marauders of Slaanesh. These are a tier 1 unit, are shielded, defenders, and are weak versus armor. These guys take the crown for the actual best defense on the Marauders unit, and along with that they have expert charge reflection, so it doesn't matter if it's infantry or monsters, the charge will be sent right back to the charger. They are great line holders with that stupid high defense for this stage of the game, but also have pretty nice attack stats and weapon strength that does fall off versus armor. Still, for the early game when you want to use them, this is just fine and they will do great work versus early game units. Just make sure they're not against any magic, as their physical resist does help them out more than you think with that low armor. As usual, keep the support coming to make the most of them. And our final Marauders unit are the dual weapon Marauders of Corn. These are another tier 1 unit, they're a damage dealer, and a frenzy. The final Marauders unit, and these ones have the best damage of this stage of the game, and of course they have to be coming from Corn. They have a nice melee attack along with some pretty tasty weapon damage and a bonus versus infantry, so our early game chaff shredders. They will melt low armor troops in the early game at a rapid pace and can sometimes get away without the usual support from other units. Just because you can doesn't mean you should, as the faster they are taken out, the less damage they will take with their less than amazing melee defense. Keep them away from high damage targets and keep them on low armor chaff, and they should do just fine. Next up we have the Chaos Warriors. These are a tier 2 unit, are armored and shielded, and come with the chaos variations of Khorne, Nurgle, Slaanesh, and Siege. These are of course a massive step up in toughness from Marauders, and are now incredibly tanky front lines units. They have that massive armor and their excellent defense, so can keep the enemy stuck in combat for an extremely long time, provided they don't have too much armor piercing damage. Their own damage isn't out of this world, but against less armored troops, they should do just fine, especially with how long they can stay in combat. Of course, you should be supporting them with the best monsters you can get at the time, to take out foes as quickly as possible, and move up onto the next unit. Pretty simple to use, so pretty simple to explain, just set them and forget them. We also have a couple of variations, first up with the Halberd Chaos Warriors. These are another tier 2 unit, are armoured, deal armour piercing anti-large damage, and have charge defense versus large. These can also come in a Khorne or a Siege variation. These swap the shields for Halberds, so gain armor piercing and anti-large damage at the cost of their shields and a tiny bit of defense. This makes them ever so slightly less tanky in melee and way weaker versus ranged, but they do become large target assassins with that large charge reflection and bonus damage. Use them to protect the flanks of your front lines and focus down large targets on the enemy force. They are still just fine versus infantry with their high damage, but also be sure to support them with other units to make the most of them. You also have great weapons Chaos Warriors. These are of course tier 2 units, and armoured and deal armor piercing damage, and can come in a Nurgle variation. These of course come with a lot more armor piercing damage and a high melee attack at the cost of a reduced defense with no shield. This makes them into the front line's damage dealers of the Chaos Warriors, as they can melt nearly any front line you place in front of them. Of course, if the enemy is also throwing back damage, they aren't going to avoid much if it's armor piercing, so they can take as much damage as they throw out. As usual, support them with other units to take out their targets as fast as possible, and take out ranged units to keep them safe from being focused down. We also have Scourges Warriors of Slaanesh. These are tier 2 units, armored and shielded, defenders, and weak versus armor. These are another great defensive unit that can hold the line for an extremely long time. You want to use them in place of your regular Warriors of Chaos to hold the enemy back and give other units in your army plenty of time to move in and do the damage. Their own damage output isn't amazing, especially against any armor, so for sure don't leave them fighting as they just won't get anywhere fast. They still have that expert charge reflection, so can also protect flanks from charges from pretty much anything. These would make for a great mid-game front line, since they are so damn tanky and can be easily charged that it's going to take the enemy weeks to get them out of the way and dig into your more valuable and damaging units. And the final Chaos Warriors are the dual weapons Chaos Warriors of Corn. These are a tier 2 units, armoured and anti-infantry, and have frenzy. Yes, these were covered in the Khorne roster, but they are technically Chaos Warriors, so I'm going to allow it. The final Chaos Warriors are of course anti-infantry, as is the Khorne way. This makes them great versus low armoured targets, as they will positively shred any chaff you put in front of them. Sadly, at this stage in the game, armour is more common, so they will quickly stop doing damage and transform into units that often hit for little damage and are often hit themselves for bigger damage. I can't see myself using them unless I know my target has no armour or resistance, otherwise you're setting yourself up for failure or a quick unit swap. Next we have Forsaken. These are a tier 2 units, are armoured, damage dealers, and have frenzy. They come with 4 marks of chaos variations: Khorne, which also grants some flaming attacks, Nurgle, Slaanesh, and Siege. These are of course the corrupted infantry of chaos and still have their weird playstyle of being nice and fast and doing high damage, but not much of it armor piercing. This places them in a similar spot to the Khorne dual weapon warriors. At this stage of the game they'll be up against armor more and more, so simply aren't going to punch through. If you unlock them early, then they will do great and clean up versus low armor early game units. But if you're in the mid game and regularly see enemy front lines with 50 armor and up, they just aren't worth it. Next we have the aspiring Pog Champions. These are a tier 3 units and are armored and shielded. Aspiring Pog Champions are a bit of a weird unit. They're only a regular infantry unit, but they're 16 entities, so they have a tiny unit size, but pretty high unit mass and decent stats to make up for this. They work well as monstrous infantry despite their size, as their high damage and great stats make them great for embedding into your front lines to do some tasty damage whilst keeping safe from being attacked. Sadly, they don't have a lot of armor piercing, so their damage will quickly fall off a cliff once you're against anything with plenty of that. They're a fun unit and for sure unique, but I wouldn't use them past the mid game unless you're sure that you're going against low armor. Next come to Chosen. These are a tier 3 unit, are armored and shielded, and come with 4 marks of chaos: Khorne, Nurgle, Slaanesh, and Siege. These are of course the endgame front lines of the Warriors of Chaos. They have magnificent armor and fantastic melee stats, so are ridiculously hard to get rid of in combat. Their damage isn't the worst, but it isn't armor piercing, so will struggle versus most late game armor. Of course you don't want to get these guys to their damage though. They are line holders through and through, and they will do their job just fine with their incredible tankiness. Use them to hold the enemy still and provide support with missiles, magic and monsters to do the real damage and take out the enemy while they're stuck in combat. They also have a couple of variations. The Halberd Chosen, they're a tier 3 unit, are armoured, deal armour piercing anti-large damage, and have charge defense versus large, and come in the Siege variation. Similar to the Chaos Warriors, these guys are slightly less tanky in exchange for some armor piercing anti-large damage and charge reflection versus large. This makes them into great flank protectors as well as large target assassins, as long as they can surround and focus their target to prevent them from running away and allow them to land as many hits as possible. Use the same as the Halberd Chaos Warriors, but just in the late game, and you can't go wrong. You're going to notice the pattern here. Great Weapon Chosen are a tier 3 unit, are armoured and deal armor piercing damage, and come with a Nurgle variation. Going to sound like a broken record, but it really is true that these are the same upgraded as Chaos Warriors here. They drop some defense in exchange for some tasty damage, which makes them deal a lot more damage in combat, but also take a lot more. If you want high damage front line, then these are your pick. But just give them plenty of support with other units, otherwise their low defense will result in a line that disappears pretty damn fast. The Scourges Chosen of Slaanesh are a tier 3 unit, are armoured and shielded, defenders, and weak versus armour. Are you sick of hearing me say the same thing over and over again? Because I am. Exactly like the past 2 tiers. They gain a ton of defense and expert charge reflection, so are the best line holders you could ask for. Use them to do just this and support them with other units and they'll do great. Don't leave them to fight alone as their damage simply will not get the job done, anywhere close to fast. And finally the Dual Weapons Chosen of Khorne. These are a tier 3 unit, armoured, damage dealers, not frenzy. And back at it again with the repetition. Gain the same sorts of upgrades as before, but these guys are such a question mark for me. They still lack a lot of meaningful armor piercing damage, so going against anything that's suited up, they're just not going to hit very hard. I don't get why you'd go for them in the late game, since basically every unit will have armor, but if you do, just focus on less armored infantry and they should do okay. Come to the Cavalry and Chariots now. First up we have the Chaos Chariots. These are a tier 2 unit, are armored and deal armor piercing damage. They come in 4 variations: Nurgle, Khorne, Slaanesh, which for some reason loses a bit of charge bonus, and Siege. As with all chariot units, you want to keep these guys on the move at all times to make the most of their damage. Have them charge in and out of the enemy back and then front lines and rack up kills while breaking the enemy with the constant damage. Don't ever let them get pinned down in melee combat, as their large size and poor stats will mean they go down incredibly fast even with their high armor. If you're not one for micro, then give these guys a miss, but if you can handle it, they'll do some great work for you. We also have the Gorebeast Chariots. These are a tier 3 unit, are armoured and deal armor piercing anti-infantry damage, and come in a Khorne variation which increases their melee attack, not that that matters. These are slower but more impactful chariots that will still perform more or less the same as the Chaos Chariots, but just move a little bit slower. This means you need to be more careful not to let it get pinned down, otherwise they will not last long. Keep them on the move, taking out back and front lines with constant charging, and they should do great work with their huge mass. Pretty much all chariots work more or less the exact same way, so not much use going into detail over it over and over again. Next we have the Chaos Knights. These are a tier 3 unit, are armoured and shielded and deal anti-infantry damage, and come with 4 Chaos variations: Khorne, Nurgle, Slaanesh, and Siege. These are your mid-game combat cap and can either be used for sustained battling or constant charging. They don't have the best charge bonus in the world, but it's not too bad, so cycle charging will do some great work, especially versus lower tier units. If you're lazy or just small-brained like me, then you can send them into charge and stain, and they will do just fine as long as not against anything with outstanding combat stats. Their weapon strength and melee stats will let them wipe most backlines out of ease, and even do okay versus some early games from lines infantry. Just don't let them get surrounded by anti-large or high armor piercing damage, and they should do just fine. They also come in a variation, the Lance Chaos Knights. These are still a tier 3 unit, and are still armoured and shielded and have anti-infantry damage, and still come with 4 marks of chaos: Khorne, Nurgle, Slaanesh, which again loses some charge bonus, and Siege. These lads trade some melee stats for a massive boost to their charge bonus. This changes them from a cav you can send in and let them stay there, to one you need to have constantly on the move and cycle charging. Have them charge into enemies and pull out before sending them back in for more, then rinse and repeat until there are no more enemies left. This requires a lot more micro, but the value you can get is crazy if done correctly. Just make sure you don't leave them in combat or let them get surrounded, as their low defense comes to bite them in the ass, and they'll go down in record speed. Next we have our Missile Cavalry and Chariots. First up we have the Marauders Horsemen. These are a tier 1 unit, very fast and come with Vanguard deployments. And they come with the Slaanesh, or Siege Chaos variations. These are your early game skirmishing missile troops that can do some decent poke damage here and there over the course of the entire battle. They won't have the highest damage in the world, but versus low armor early game troops, they'll do just fine and pick up a few kills here and there as long as you keep them safe. I like to stick them onto skirmish mode and send them in to fire at the backs of the enemy front lines to avoid any friendly fire. Just make sure they don't get focused down by enemy range when stood still or cornered, as their survivability is pretty piss poor. If they manage to run out of ammo, then have them take out nearly dead units that are possibly retreating, as they just don't have the stats to take on anything else. They also come in another variation, Throwing Axe Marauder Horsemen. These are now shielded and deal armor-piercing damage. They also have the Corn variation, which increases weapon strength and charge bonus, and the Nurgle variation. These guys trade some ammo and range for armor-piercing damage. This means you have to get much closer to your target to hit and have less missiles to launch, but the missiles launch will be doing more damage and can get through even the toughest of defenses. They still want to be used the same as the base unit, but now you can focus on high armor tags on the enemy force, rather than sending them just anywhere. Still keep them safe from ranged and melee fighting, as they're still terribly weak and cannot survive in combat for very long at all. And finally we have the Marauder Horsemasters. These are a tier 2 unit, are very fast and have vanguard deployment, and have no chaos variations. These have a longer range and a little bit more survivability, but just don't have the armor piercing damage of the throwing axes. This means they'll be easy to keep alive and get into a firing position, but once they're up against late game units, their damage will just stop pushing through. For this reason, I don't really like to upgrade to these guys, as without armor piercing damage, they just won't hold up if you take them into the late game. They're plenty fine versus less armored units, but the longer the campaign goes on, the less of those you come across. Now comes the monsters and beasts. First up we have the Chaos Warhounds. These are a tier 1 unit, are very fast, have vanguard deployment, scalar skin, which is missile resist, and are unfortunately weak versus armor. They also come with a Corn variation. Alone, these lads are pretty hopeless and will fall over unless against the weakest of enemy units. However, once you get a couple of them to gang up against some enemy backlines, you can wipe enemies from the field in seconds. You still have to make sure they don't get caught out by enemy units that can actually put up a fight, otherwise they will go down quick no matter how much they outnumber the target. Their other use is running down retreating units. Nothing wipes them out as fast as Warhounds, and they can do great work towards army losses by obliterating enemy numbers and making sure they never come back. They also come in a variation, Poison Chaos Warhounds. The only difference between these and the base unit is they gain poison damage. Using them the same, they'll just do a better job. No point saying more than that, as it would just be more repetition in this already very long video. Next we have the Chaos Feral Manticore. This is a tier 2 unit, causes terror, but unfortunately does have rampage. This is one of the few flying units in the Undivided roster. Its lack of armor piercing damage makes it best suited at attacking enemy backlines and other less armored foes. This is reinforced by that rampage that will activate if they take too much damage, and more often than not will result in them running headlong into enemy troops to their own doom. Keep them attacking backlines clumps with that massive damage in area attacks, and keep them safe from all forms of damage and getting pinned down, as once you lose control of them, chances are they won't be coming back. Next we have Chaos Trolls. These are a tier 2 unit, deal armor piercing damage, have regeneration, but poor leadership. These are your standard early-ish game front lines monsters that want to embed themselves in your infantry to deal some great damage and protect themselves from too much damage. Their high armor piercing and area attacks allow them to hit multiple entities at once and deal a ton of damage when they do. They aren't the toughest, and with that poor leadership they'll be running as soon as they get even a whiff of trouble. If they start to take too many hits, pull them out to regen some HP and leadership, then send them back in for more. Just keep them safe and let them do their jobs, you can't really go too far wrong. They also come with a variation, the Armored Chaos Trolls. They get armor, another unit that is the exact same as the base unit aside from one difference. They gain 70 armor, so now a lot tougher versus all forms of non-armor piercing damage. Doesn't really change how you want to use them and only makes them better at that very same job. Keep an eye out for armor piercing damage coming their way, and you should be just fine. Next we have Chaos Spawn. These are a tier 3 unit, deal anti-infantry damage, and damage dealers, and are unbreakable. They come with 4 chaos variations, Corn, which gains flaming attacks, Nurgle, Slanesh, which gains a soporific musk, and Siege, which gains armor sundering attacks. These are very similar to Chaos Trolls, but also different in basically every way. They want to be used the same, so embed them in your front lines and have them wail on enemy troops whilst being protected by your own. However, they're lacking a lot of armor piercing damage, so will struggle once the enemy gets too tough. On the upside, they will stay until they fall with their unbreakable leadership, so will be dealing damage until the very end. Honestly, between these guys and the Trolls, it's really situational. Trolls better versus armored and less damaging targets since they will deal more damage, but not be able to stay there as long. These guys better versus high damage low armor targets with their high non-armor piercing damage and total lack of armor, but unbreakable leadership. Next we have the Chaos War Shrine. This is a tier 3 unit, has Encourage and increasing support auras, Giver of Glory, which gets stronger as any entity dies nearby, and the Favor of Ruinous Powers. It also has 4 chaos variations. Corn, which gains flaming attacks and replaces Giver of Glory with Giver of Furious Glory, Nurgle, which replaces it with Giver of Abundant Glory, Slanesh, which gains a soporific musk and trades it for Giver of Torturous Glory, and Siege, which replaces it with Giver of Arcane Glory. This is more or less the same as the Sorcerers, but without the caster. They're large support units that want to be placed in the middle of as many friendly units as possible to provide them with an array of buffs. Despite their high damage and HP, I'd be hesitant to send them into combat, especially against anything with remotely decent damage, as their poor melee stats and large size will make them an easy target to focus down. Either send them in versus super low damage enemies, or simply have them on the back lines in the middle of as many units as you can to support them with all those buffs. Next we have the Chaos Giant. This is a tier 3 unit, deals armor piercing anti-infantry damage, and causes terror. Sadly, Giants still haven't really been fixed in Warhammer 3, and with more factions than ever, with access to a ton of ranged units capable of burning this massive HP bar several times over, they're not exactly getting any better. They are easily focused down by even the weakest ranged units due to their massive size and slow speed, and that missile resist isn't really doing much to change things. If you're going against an army with totally zero ranged units, then they should do okay and be able to do some good work with their massive area attacks and huge damage. Sling them into the middle of a clump of enemies and watch their damage climb. Just also watch out for high damage anti-large, as getting surrounded can also bring their HP crashing down. Dragon Ogres are next. These are another tier 3 unit, deal armor piercing anti-large damage and have scaly skin. These are of course the best pseudo cav you could ever ask for, with their decent speed and excellent damage. They can sprint around the map and take on pretty much whatever you want. As long as they don't have a ton of anti-large damage, they should do just fine as long as they also don't get surrounded. They deal amazing damage and have pretty decent melee stats, so can take on pretty much anything you want. If you don't fancy this, then they can also do great as front lines monsters, but you'll be leaving that speed value on the table if you go for this option. Either way, they'll do great work, so just take some and you can't really go too wrong. And our final monster is the Dragon Ogre Shagoff. These are a tier 3 unit, are armored, deal armor piercing damage, cause terror, and have scaly skin. This is basically a bigger Dragon Ogre, but there's just one of them. It's faster and it's stronger. It can do anything they can do, but in a single entity with even higher damage and melee stats. With the armor piercing and anti-large bonus, they make for great large target assassins that can duel other single entities with ease and deal a ton of damage while they're there. The only thing you need to be scared of are armor piercing missile focus and armor piercing anti-large infantry swarms. Let them get focused by either of these, and they will quickly start to melt. Anything else, they'll clean up. And our final unit is the only artillery and war machine, and it is of course the Hell Cannon. It's a tier 3 unit, has armor piercing missiles, and Doomfire, which causes hit units to have reduced leadership, and also these shots seek their targets. And to top it all off, it's unbreakable, but for an artillery unit, it's a little bit strange. One of my personal favourite units in the game, based on the fact it's artillery, the appearance, and the insane damage it can do. Yes, being one cannon does mean our damage is quite focused on the map, but that damage is going to be pretty bloody high and can take out entire units in just a few shots. Homing shots deal magical and armor piercing damage, so there is nothing that can save enemies from this guy unless they are insanely fast or lucky. Since it's a single shot, the most efficient targets are large single entities, since all that damage can be focused onto one HP bar rather than being spread between a bunch of entities. The chance of missing is higher, but when you do hit, you're going to take a very big chunk of HP off the target. Just keep them safe from being flanked or focused by ranged, as they cannot run or defend themselves, and if you lose the artillery piece, then you'll have a load of unbreakable useless dwarves carrying very valuable ammo that they now can't use. Now comes the Regiments of Renown. I'll call out the units, what they were units of, and the differences from the base unit. The Mirror Guard are a Chaos Warriors unit, and gain the mark of Slanesh and the Supreme Vanity ability. The Demon Spew are a Forsaken unit, and gain the mark of Nurgle, cause fear, and have the Swarm of Flies ability. The Severed Claw are Aspiring Champions, and gain the mark of Siege, Expert Charge Reflection, Anti-Large, and Armor Piercing damage. The Sibilant Slaughtercade are Chaos Chariots, gain the mark of Slanesh, Vanguard deployments, cause fear, devastating flanker, and soul hunters. The Swords of Chaos are Chaos Knights, and have reduced health and melee defense for increased weapon strength and armor piercing damage, immunity to psychology, guardian, and apocalyptic charge. The Knights of Immolation are Doom Knights of Siege, and gain searing torment. Knights of the Brazen Throne are Skull Crushers of Corn, gain the ability to cause terror, flaming attacks, and murderous charge. The Weird Spawn are Chaos Spawn, and gain the mark of Siege, armor sundering attacks, and cause terror. The Summoners of Rage are Dragon Ogres, gain magical attacks, and the Chain Lightning bound spell. Bilious Thunderguff is a Chaos Giant, and gains the mark of Nurgle and Violent Wind, and the Soul of Damnation is a Hell Cannon, and gains increased ammo and the Soul Devourer ability. Now comes the army compositions. In Warhammer 3, every unit has a tier from 1 to 3, so I'm going to use these tiers to make you armies for the early, mid, and late game, so that you are set for every single step of your campaign. Now since in the faction the only units that can be used by everyone are the Undivided ones, I'll stick to those for my comps, but I'll also mention some substitutes if you're playing Undivided and can use all 5 rosters. Starting in tier 1, we're going to be leading our army with a Chaos Sorcerer of Shadows. We're going to bring 8 Marauders, though you could swap in 2 or 3 Blue Horrors for ranged and give your army a little more depth. And you could also swap the regular Marauders for the Hell Scourges, since they are simply the best line holder you could have at this stage of the game, so are a no-brainer. You can go with 6 Poison Chaos Warhounds and 5 Marauder Horsemen, and again you could swap some Plague Toads in for a couple of the Warhounds and the Horsemen to gain some monster presence in the front line, rather than having so many hounds and horses. So the Chaos Sorcerer Lords will only get better as they level up and get their spells online, and early on they'll still be able to do some decent fighting, as long as they aren't against anything with too much damage. The Marauders are the toughest option you have at this stage. Of course the Hell Scourges will do better if you can get them, but if not, use whatever has the best defensive stats to get them holding the line and letting your other units take care of the rest. Poison Warhounds are like regular Warhounds but better, and will do great versus early game's backlines and get a ton of value versus retreating units, racking up a huge number of kills. Horsemen are just fine for this stage of the game when there aren't too many armoured targets on the field. You can grab Throne Axe if you really want, but this early on the extra damage won't be as valuable as the armour or range that these lads have. Swapping some Plague Toads in to reduce the numbers of Warhounds, and these lads will do great to beef up the front lines and give your Marauders a hand. Coming to tier 2, You have our Chaos Sorcerer of Shadows, and you can pick up the Mark of Nurgle if you really want. Also going to grab a Chaos Sorcerer of Fire hero. For the front line is going to go with 2 Halberd Warriors of Chaos and 4 regular Warriors of Chaos. Again, you could replace the entire line with Hell Scourges if you really want the best of the best line holders, or you could just replace the regular Warriors if you still want the armor piercing anti-large, protecting the flanks. Going to go with 4 Throne Axe Marauder Horsemen, which could be swapped out for the Pink Horrors of Siege for a more traditional missile line with high magical damage. Going to go with 4 Armored Chaos Trolls, 2 Chaos Feral Manticores, which could swap for some Screamers of Siege, since more entities tend to be better versus large groups of infantry. And finally going to go with 2 Poison Chaos Warhounds. These could be swapped out for some Chaos Chariots if you can handle the micro, or Flesh Hands of Corn for a more high damage Hounds unit. At Lord will have their spells in line by this point and can pick up a Mark of Chaos if you really want, or just save them for an undivided Demon Prince. Should also be on a mount by now and either go for that Dragon for fighting or the Shrine for aura buffs. The second caster will put strain onto your Winds of Magic to use the channeling stance to build up those reserves, because these are 2 laws you really want to use. The beefier front lines will do a great job of holding the enemy in place and make it easier for damage units to take them out, and will also do some decent work against less armoured front lines on the enemy side. The Throne Axe Horsemen have the armor piercing damage to keep up with the rising armor in the later game, and will do great work even if they need a little bit of micro to stay on target. The Armor Trolls will do great work in the front lines with their armor piercing attacks, and will clap anything you can put them in front of at this stage, as long as you keep them safe from taking too much damage. The Manticores are going to be used to focus down enemy back lines and work with the dire wolves to break and wipe them out as quickly as possible. Finally, we come to tier 3. Our army is now going to be led by a Demon Prince of Shadows, and we of course still have that Chaos Sorcerer of Fire. For the front line, it's going to go with 2 Halberd Chosen and 4 regular Chosen. Again, could swap the entire line with regular Chosen with Hell Scourges if you're looking for the best line holder at this tier. Going to go for 2 Lance Chaos Knights, which can be replaced by some endgame Seeker Chariots if possible, or some Khorne Skull Crushers if you fancy. Going to go with 1 Chaos War Shrine, as variations for every branch, should just pick your favourites. Going to go with 3 Dragon Ogre Shagoffs, which can be replaced by any of the endgame Demons of Chaos, since they're all exceptional in combat. I'm going to go with 2 regular Dragon Ogres, which could also use the Fiends of Slaanesh, since they will be used as fast moving and possibly flanking monsters. And finally, closing things out, we're going to go with 2 Hell Cannons, which could definitely swap with some Soul Grinders of Nurgle or Siege for some battling alongside their ranged prowess. Now have your Lord in a powerful battling and flying form, so even if you lose that aura, you still get great value all over the map with that fighting and the Lore of Magic. The Sorcerer will have all their spells online and be on their own War Shrine mount, so be providing passive and active support all over the battlefield. The front line will be incredibly tough and hold enemies still forever, especially if they don't have plenty of armor piercing damage. The Cav will do work in the back line, taking out ranged units before coming back to charge into the backs of the front lines. Just keep them cycle charging and on the move and they'll do just fine. If you can't handle that, go for regular Chaos Knights. The War Shrine can be placed to buff units that the Sorcerer can't with their passive buffs, and the Shagoff or Demons will be used to focus down other large targets on the enemy force and take them down as fast as possible with their massive damage, but they can also do great work in the front lines, so just send them wherever and they'll do great. The regular Dragon Ogres are going to be flanking the front lines to charge them from the back once the lines have clashed and deal a ton of damage, as well as shattering enemy morale with massive amounts of pressure. And finally, the artillery will of course be sitting at the back, raining death onto wherever you wish. If it's Hell Cannons, then focus down single targets and large clumps, as they really are the best for those high damage projectiles. And that's everything you need to know on how to play the Warriors of Chaos in battle. We've got the campaign guide for the Skaven coming on Monday, so subscribe if you want to see that. Home tip 50k by the end of the year, so I sure would appreciate the assistance. If you enjoyed this video and or found it useful, then consider dropping it a like, and if you really enjoy the content and want to support it directly, then consider becoming a member here on YouTube or Patreon on the Patreon. Doing so gets you early insights into future content, increased voting power, and discounts on merch, as well as shoutouts at the end of videos, just like Henry Tucker for his support at the Officers tier. Thank you to all supporters, and one last thank you for watching, and for now, I've been COLONELDAMNEDERS, and I will see you next turn.